So Rich Hoffman has a BA in Organizational Communications from Wright State University. He's an information technology consultant and strategist. He's currently working as an enterprise architect at Redstone Arsenal and the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville. I think you're still doing that, Rich. I'm not sure if you've retired yet from that. He's got over 50 years, probably over 60 years now, experience in the research and investigation of UAP phenomena. Rich is also a MUFON member and an executive board member with SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. If you'd like more information on SCU, it's a great organization. Just head to their website, explorescu.org. And I'll turn it over to you, Rich. I'm not quite sure what I have to do here. So Jared, can you help me out with that? I think I have to stop screen sharing and send it to Rich.
I call this thing investigating UFOs for 6 decades. What has changed? I've been doing this now. I got started in 1964. If you go to the next slide, my start into the UFO world, if you would. I got started from an 8th grade science class, believe it or not. I was told to do a 10-minute presentation on a topic that was on a list that was passed around. I was late to class. Nobody put their name next to the word UFOs, and so I was the stucky for it, So I got my name now next to that, and I had no idea what it was. I went up after class and I asked my science teacher. I said, "Well, what's a UFO?" He said, "Unidentified flying object." I said, "What's that?" I never heard of it. Young kid. Anyway, 13 years old. What do you expect? Little did I know that he was very knowledgeable about it, because I lived in Dayton, Ohio, and that's where this thing was, And of course, Wright Pat was just up the street with all the different projects from, Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book. And obviously my teacher was a little bit older and understood what the heck all that was, right? So, I mean, he put it on the list. And so, I literally bombed it. I didn't really do any kind of studying. I think I might have looked at an encyclopedia and got a little bit, but I was probably reading a book, My Trip to Venus, or My Saturnian Lover, or something of that nature, because I bombed it. And then he hit me up with all of the wonderful questions, like, well, what about jet pursuits? What about this? What about that? I'm going like, well, what book did you read? So I got my D on the report that day, and I went home that evening, and I was like watching the news, and Walter Cronkite came on talking about the Socorro, New Mexico case with the patrolman Lonnie Zamora, who had seen this egg-shaped object out in an area with an insignia on it, and a couple beings that were apparently walking around the craft. And then the thing takes and shoots up in the air, and then there's like what looks like maybe a flame or something underneath it. The object then stops and then shoots off over him, and then goes into the town and is seen by other people along the road. Anyway, the point is that I heard that, and I'm thinking like, wow, that I was now kind of curious and interested, to the point where a couple of days later, my aunt was going into a bookstore, and I went in and I said, well, do you have any books on unidentified flying objects? And the next thing is I got the book called The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by former head of Project Blue Book, which was Ruppelt. And I started reading that. And if you read the very first sentence of the book, you'll find out that they were shooting at him. So I figured that this must have been the book that my professor actually, or my teacher had actually read, or something of that nature. So if you go to the next slide, that's kind of my foray into the whole thing. I began getting as many newspaper clippings as I could on the topic. The next thing I know, I was at age 15, I was already going around doing presentations on the topic to adult groups, like clubs and various churches and stuff like that. And then Phil Donahue heard that I was in town, and he was as well. His show originated there, and then went up to Chicago, where he really became famous. And I went on the Phil Donahue show, and the next thing you know, I became the UFO guy in Dayton, Ohio. And then eventually in 1969, by the way, I heard about this group called the Midwest UFO Network. I joined it. and that later became MUFON. So I've been with MUFON since, it's just after its inception anyway. And so I got to understand what that was all about. Anyway, just a note about some of the times, just to help bring up some recollections for maybe some of you who were around at that time, or if you weren't, you'll be aware of it just from what I'm saying. But we didn't have things like cell phones, computers, and even cassette players, and so rotary phones were still used. Cameras were boxy kind of cameras with negatives. I mean, it was even before the Polaroid stuff started to come out, really. It was right around that time that Polaroid was starting to develop. We had, World War II vintage Geiger counters. That's what I used when I was out, because the next thing I was investigating cases like left and right, because there was what they call a flap in 1965 that I was caught off guard with. And a flap is just a high concentration of sightings in a given area. And so I was running around trying to do this on my own, and occasionally would bump into, a Blue Book investigator. Got connected to the people at the base at Project Blue Book. I was even given a phone number that I could call up to go to radar approach control. And I could let them know I've got an object down here, and they would be able to just point out what it might be or something like that in the area. Obviously, they didn't give me classified flights, but they, definitely did say that, hey, we do have something down there that we're picking up, which was nice. Also about this, we still, use paper and pens. If I had cases I was going on, I'd have people draw it with paper, give them a piece of paper, give them some crayons or something like that, colored pencils. And that's how you had to, give me some information. The libraries are basically where I got information. I had to go to the library and check out things because, like you're looking at star charts or various other kinds of things, it just, you didn't have that like phone like you have now. And so it was a bit odd. And then, you had to mail using the post office. So it wasn't such a thing as email, but you had to mail to people via the post office. And that's how you exchanged your information with anybody that was a witness or something. So well, that's a little bit about the time that I got started, about this is a kind of like, the Beatles were popular. Okay, well, anyway, that's the nature of the time. So I wanted to give you that. Next slide, please. Okay, basically in the objects that were being seen in 1960s to the 70s anywhere, were mostly sightings of, like, you had daylight discs were being seen, disc-shaped objects followed by spheres. You had cylinders that were also being reported. People called them like cigar-shaped objects or cigar objects at the time, and even before that, in the 50s and stuff like that, they were called cigars. But you also have nocturnal lights, so lights in the sky that would be reported. You have a variation in the shapes and sizes being recorded. You'd have everything from a disc-shaped object. They were called, some people call them flying saucers. Some people would use different terminology to talk about them. But, you had everything from very small objects to very, very large objects that were being seen. So it seemed like that there was no consistency, like they were all a certain size or anything like that. You had vehicle effects, electromagnetic effects that were being reported, where cars would stop and then they would start back up again, that were happening, and so we seemingly, for that time period, the nature of how the car engines would work, it seemed like that you had some sort of like effect from that. Occasionally, you'd also have things like, radios, people's radios in their houses or their TVs would act up, or you might have, other kinds of electromagnetic effects being reported. But, again, it wasn't like, somebody's cell phone was going off, because that was not even a part of the equation, or their computer was acting up. You had ground effects and trace cases that were periodically reported, where people were seeing things like damaged limbs, trees, burnt soil, burnt grass, burnt everything you can think of that were going on. And you had, so that was pretty much common throughout that time period. You had physiological effects, some people talking about burns or paralysis or their skin heating up or headaches or various other kinds of things associated with sightings. Sometimes it was proximity to the craft. Other times it might not even be a proximity to the craft that were being seen. You had, a lot of variation. Some people saw beings that, they would describe as being very human. Then you had some that were being reported as being very hairy. If you look at the Kelly Hopkinsville case, even back in that time period, you're having like, where they were shooting at these things. They were like small, diminutive, like robots, if you would. They had a metal sound when the bullets would hit them, and then they'd kind of like roll backward, if you would, or something like that, and then come back at them. All kinds of variations of beings, just as much also in the variation of the craft. So there's not like a common thing. Even when we talk about flying saucers or flying discs, even those had variations with them. But there would be certain things that you would hear about and understand. Well, the discs, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, but there are also abduction cases that came along in the 61 time frame, and even before that. But 61, you had all the Betty and the Barney Hill case or stuff like that, eventually was brought up. And then the next thing you know is you were starting hearing more and more about abduction cases that were people claiming that they were actually being taken aboard the craft. You had in the 70s, you had in 73, you had a huge flap period that was going on. And that's when Calvin Parker and Charlie Hickson down in Pascagoula, Mississippi, had their encounter and were taken aboard the craft. So you had a lot of that type of thing going on, and cases that you'd have to deal with that actually got into that. Let's go to the next slide, please. Hang on a second. I'm trying to get my slide to change. Okay. Object characteristics, primarily, again, you had everything from hovering discs. Typically it was the disc-shaped objects that were the ones that were doing what we call a falling leaf pattern, where they kind of like a leaf going down in the fall, it rocks back and forth as it's stationary. That was, at that time period, the disc-shaped object was especially being seen like that. Today we have the triangles, and they don't have that same effect. And so that's an interesting thing that we could talk about. You also had things like instantaneous acceleration from the standpoint. So you would actually see the object shooting off. The problem is that we didn't have the radar capabilities that we have now to be able to track something that's going at hypersonic speeds or something of that nature. But, and so you were trying to interpret that from radar. Sometimes they're picked up on radar, sometimes they're not. But again, objects that were described as like departing at very, very quick speeds. You didn't have any kind of repulsion effects quite often, where they were coming back and you felt something hitting you. If you were standing there and watching it on the ground, the object would take off very silently most often, and then it would just be gone, So sound was not a common thing described with them. They seemed to be always talked about. No sonic booms were heard or anything of that nature. There was no observable propulsion that was being seen. It's not like you could see necessarily all times an effect in the atmosphere that indicated that the propulsion was coming from, let's say, a certain hole aboard the disc-shaped craft or anything like that. You didn't see any kind of propulsion system when you looked at it. And these are all the same thing that you're going to hear today from the 5 characteristics, for example, that Lou Elizondo spoke about, which are the, instantaneous acceleration, no observable propulsion systems, and the vertical lift issue, and then the disappearing or cloaking like kind of thing not being able to be picked up. the object would make 90-degree turns back then. It could make 120-degree turns. It didn't matter. It could just be going one direction. The next thing it's taking off in another direction. It could also do a complete reversal and come back the opposite way. So you had that kind of a thing being reported. Again, electromagnetic effects, depending upon proximity. There seemed to be sometime lights around the craft, and then other times no lights around the craft, or it was like the craft or whatever like that was completely glowing. So people would report it as being just a light in the sky. And quite often, when you did manage to get any kind of photographs that were taken, it was often the fact that they were quite blurred. And so we question whether or not there is a field around the objects that is causing that blur or distortion, and not always just the camera. But you do have a problem with motion blur that you'll find in a lot of photographs and various other kinds of things like that. So, I mean, it's hard to tell, I guess is what I'm trying to say. But we are starting to pick up the fact that there are these fields around the craft, and sometimes the interaction of that field with our actual atmosphere is creating what they call an ionization level, where the electrons are now exchanging or going back and forth between the field and the atmosphere. And then that causes it to light up. And so consequently, it can go through those kind of changes. Next, if you go to the next slide, other noted characteristics are they appearing to be both solid 1 minute and then non-solid the next. You can have structured or non-structured craft. And then you have to question whether or not you were dealing with something that was actually physically there, or was it more like it was just an illusion, or something of that nature, because we really didn't understand where the craft were coming from, how they were being, what they were doing, whether they were distorting space and time in some way, or whether they were doing some other kinds of things. So it was very, very difficult. And then you have the problem with the fact there are natural phenomena that also can look or be non-solid. And I'll give you an example of that with the Earth light phenomena. Earth lights have a tendency to be balls of gases that can glow and can move against the wind. It can get up to 22,000 feet altitudes and even higher. And it's nothing more than just a bunch of gas that's in like a bubble. And that I've investigated those. Those are kind of like strange. They're also all over the planet, where these things repeatedly are being seen, and they're confused with being, structured craft or UFOs by a lot of witnesses. You also have leaving effects on soil, plant life. I told you about, you get those physical effects. You can have microwave radiation, magnetic effects that will show up, like on automobiles, for example, where the car is now magnetized, if you would. You can have burned vegetation. A lot more kinds of effects are noted. If you look at any of the work by Ted Phillips, who was part of MUFON as well, he had collected something, this is decades ago, but he had collected over 4,000 physical effects cases that he had looked at and recorded what was going on there. So quite a bit of that type of thing that's also going on. You have objects that can materialize and dematerialize out of nowhere. We've talked about whether or not that is some sort of we think of the show called Star Trek or something like that, where the Romulans are able to decloak and cloak. We don't know if that's the kind of thing, whether they're materializing or that's some sort of an effect of them moving in between, space and time, if you would. We just don't know. There's variation. Sometimes they have landing gear, sometimes they don't. Why is it 1 minute that they've got landing gear, like the Socorro, New Mexico case? And then other times where they don't seemingly have that kind of gear and they just hover above the ground. So again, those kind of variations happen. And then there's the question about weight variations that's come up, where, for example, in France, you have a situation where an object had something that basically came down on a railroad track, and it actually dented the railroad track, which is a huge weight being applied to that. You also have, I've investigated cases where you've seen depressions in soil from something of a weight that's in the center of it, that's compressed to soil. And other times you don't have that. If you and we'll talk about this in the Nimitz case, you have an object that basically what it must have been reduced to having no mass to be able to move at like 44,000 miles an hour. Anyway, you have the question of whether they're piloted or not piloted. Of course, if no being steps out of it, you don't know. You assume that it might have some pilot in, but you might be wrong. And then you have objects that are also being seen the size of a grapefruit that maybe is glowing, that can move around and do things just as quickly as the larger craft. And you have to question whether or not there's like somebody that can fit on the inside of a grapefruit. But one thing you also can tell is sometimes they appear, besides of their crazy random behavior of where they show up and when they show up and what they do, which you try to figure out, like, well, what is it doing, and then we try to use our own human understanding on it, and we want to go and put our own little bias on that and say, well, it's doing this because this is what humans do. Well, it's not necessarily the case that what an alien race, or if that's what it is doing either. But they appear to be intelligently controlled back even in the early days. They seem to skitter off very quickly after they've been detected. It's almost like they were doing some sort of a mission and they didn't want to be seen. And so if you look over the period of time that I was doing cases and investigating with MUFON, bottom line is that you couldn't figure out why they were doing what they were doing, why they were showing up at these locations, what was the purpose. And I think now we understand a little bit more of that. In fact, many of you probably heard Larry Hancock's presentation where we're looking at intent now on nuclear bases, and we're saying that there was an intent to go and visit these things. I can talk more about the intelligent control later on. Patterns, the next slide. They seem to be seen quite often over, under, around water. I noted that early on, even in the Dayton, Ohio area, where I was starting to see that it seemed like that they were around water quite a bit. In fact, I had cases that were popped up where they were hanging over ponds and doing something like sucking water into them. I'm going like, okay, there seems to be water going on. That's important. And of course, today we hear about all the naval ships that are reporting them in their exercise areas over or around water, right, over the ocean. And we're starting to see more and more that the objects are actually transmedium and that they can come out of water, go into space, and they hit all three of the mediums we've got with equal ease. We obviously note then, I've already talked about it, but nuclear materials, production site, storage, detonation events, they seem to have an interest in that nuclear aspect. And I don't, you could argue the fact that when we started having detonations in the ocean, that quite conceivably we were probably upsetting where they were actually had a base and are quite concerned about what the idiots upstairs are doing, and started showing up with greater frequency. And then trying to send them to follow and go where all these nuclear storage areas and production sites and everything else are. And then trying to figure out, well, let's send them a message. Let's detonate, let's turn off 20 of their missiles. Do you get it now? Okay, quit playing with nukes. So anyway, you could look at it like that, but bottom line is we know that they seem to have this connection to nuclear materials. And we're also, that was noted in various early Air Force projects, by the way, that they seem to be around these sites. And that was a concern. The time of day, I heard Dr. Jalen Hynek present to the Engineers Club in Dayton, Ohio. And during his presentation, he was giving all these different statistics. He talked about the time of day, the when's the most frequency. Obviously, it's easier for you to see a light on a dark background than it is for you to see a dark object on a light background. So consequently, more reports come in for nighttime sightings because your eyes are directed to the light and you see that. But how many times do you see the aircraft going overhead during the course of the day? Not very often. And so unless it's relatively close or you get something that drags you out in the day, you rarely see them. But it also had, like, there was a frequency from 9 until 1 a.m. at night. And then also, interestingly enough, from 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. in the morning.
Oh,
Sorry, I think I blinked out there for a second. Can you hear me again?
yes.
All right. So, time of day from 9 to 1, 5 to 7 a.m. And then certain months, it seemed like the period of July was like when we're all outside, or June or July, we started to see increased frequencies in the northern hemisphere. And interestingly enough, in the southern hemisphere, when they're having their winter, that's when they had their largest number of sightings. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Next slide, please. Then you have I mentioned flaps. During peak years, there seem to be like these like cases where you'd have a large volume of UFOs. In 1965, I told you I got hooked into that one. In 1957, you also had a large peak. You also, in 1973, had a large peak. And then it goes on from there. And then over a period of time, you had a lot of other areas where you'll see those concentrations. I was literally had 100 reports easily in Dayton, Ohio, a week that I had to investigate. And it was very, very tough. I was trying to be able to get as many people read into the whole thing and how to do it. And, I was quickly training up, investigators to be able to go out and to help me get that. And so, I mean, we were able to get through it all. But 73, if you ever read Leonard Stringfield's book called Situation Red, the UFO Siege, it's all about the 1973 cases. And you can also see me in the cases that I covered in his book. Next, if you would. Uh, okay, so possible origins. I mean, so when often I'm asked, like, well, where are these things from? Yeah, it's not like I know, it's have I had a chance to talk to any one of them? I haven't had that, I mean, I'd like to be able to have that experience and say, hey, where are you all from? You come and visit me sometime or take me up there where you're from. But that doesn't happen. So now we're left looking for example, is there a license plate on the back of the craft that I can look at and it would say, like, it's from North Dakota, or something like that. No, it's nothing like that. So we sit there speculating because, until you have one of them land, you can actually talk to one. You're left with abduction cases or something of that nature to go on. And I've got books over here with, beings reported from every part of the universe, and so, you've heard that Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2 with Betty and Barney Hill, and you've heard other cases where, oh, it's the star Sirius or something of that nature. So, you also have things that are competing hypotheses, like, they're time travelers. If you take a look at many of the beings that are reported, again, I mentioned that they look like us, look like humans. And even the grays, if you would, that are being reported are bipedal. And if you think about all the beings on this planet, we are the only ones that are bipedal all the time, that stand upright, have our heads turned up the way it's turned, and have the two eyes, the mouth and the two ears and everything else. And so then you have to question whether or not these could potentially be beings from us, if you would, from a future, and are that these objects are basically, materializing and dematerializing, might be objects from a future time, or they're somehow manipulating space and time to be able to do this. And so, I mean, if you talk to Dr. Michael Masters, his whole thesis and his works are on the fact that that's probably explains the explanation that's the best suited for them. or at least some of them anyway. That you also have the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is they're from another planet somewhere else, and maybe they've been here. Maybe they've been out roaming the universe over the billions of years, even ahead of us, and could have been from a planet where they've got like millions of years ahead from us, and they've been out scanning the universe for a very, very long time and happened upon some sort of beings like us and just stuck around and said, let's have a base and let's just monitor and report back what we're seeing from these beings, right? You also have the idea that there might be interdimensional. Of course, that's the difference between Hynek and Hynek tended toward the ET, and then Jacques Vallée tended toward the interdimensional hypothesis, saying that they're not really from here, that they're potentially like from another parallel universe or another plane of existence, and they move between these dimensions. And then you have to question with scientists. Well, they believe that there's multiple universes, if you would, and they can believe in the multiverse to some extent, and they believe that there might be that kind of thing going on where there could be potentially other dimensions, if you would. I think the latest count was like up to 10 or something of that nature, according to scientists. But anyway, the idea is that they can manipulate that type of dimensional change or shift, and that's what they're doing. And then I came up with one called "They've Always Been Here." Bottom line is that if you look throughout recorded history, all of our earlier writings, and if you look at all of our cultures on the planet, throughout time, we've had instances where people have reported them, and so the question is, have they always been here on this planet? And maybe they preceded us, or something of that nature. And then there's the question about, the abduction cases, and are they doing genetic hybridization or manipulation of the genes? And have they been doing that for a long time on this planet and helping us to evolve, if you would, or whatever? We don't know. I mean, who knows? I don't have any way of knowing. But again, it's a hypothesis, and we just like sit here and say, well, let's try to see if we can prove a hypothesis, and that's become very problematic. Or it could be completely something else, an unknown. We just don't understand at all. And then the other hypothesis is that it could be all of those, or all those things could be coming into play, meaning that we could have ET visiting us, we could have time travelers visiting us, and interdimensional kinds of objects that are being reported. And so, how do we know? We don't know. So sightings are a mixed bag of objects. They're all over the place. We just don't know. And the vast majority of the objects or sightings that people have are most often they're misidentified natural or conventional objects that are being seen. And anybody that's been out watching a drone moving across the sky can readily see how quickly it can appear to be moving in the sky and confuse the heck out of people. And then if you look at our advanced aircraft that we're developing, which are, it's phenomenal. We're starting to see these changes and stuff like that, where they're starting to take on appearances and flight characteristics that could readily confuse people. And so, I've been out, I was literally put into a patrol car in Dayton, Ohio, and I went out. They took me out to a case where there are 30 people standing out there looking at the sky and saying that they were seeing something, and they were seeing the planet Venus. And so I had to go break the news that they were all looking at the planet Venus. And anyway, bottom line was the rest of the time that I was doing what I was doing, I was getting reports going around the entire city of Dayton pointing out the same thing. So we've had objects that are seen by most all of us. If you talk to young people, they're all looking down at their cell phones instead of what's up in the sky. And we don't spend a lot of time looking up and understanding what's up there. In fact, I was doing with MUFON, I was trying to get people to understand you need to really investigate IFOs as opposed to UFOs, because you have to be able to sort through all that stuff and figure out, when you investigate a case, what's the logical explanation for it. And you find out that many of them are misidentified. I mean, people are just not knowledgeable about what's up there. So anyway, I've already mentioned that objects and beings have large variations in shapes and sizes. Okay, let's to the next slide. Again, doing investigations, I kind of got into the investigative world early on. I told you I joined, well, I was in NICAP and early on, and then I was in MUFON. Then I told you about the flap. But, here I started receiving, calls and tips about sightings in Dayton, and they were about, 10 calls a day sometimes. And I didn't know initially how to investigate. I had the initial Midwest UFO Network investigator's manual, if you would, which was only about maybe like 10 pages or something. Not quite enough to be able to help you out, but you try to figure that out. And so, trying to do investigations was a challenge. But it also put you in touch with the witnesses, and you were talking firsthand to witnesses all the time. And so there are so many people that research this topic who have never done that and never gone out and talked directly with witnesses or investigated the sites where these things are. But they speak from their perspective of wisdom, if you would, that they get from other books and things like that. And it's a whole other experience to go out and to talk with witnesses right after they've had their sighting. And that's a problem too, because it's always right after their sighting, and the object's not there for you to see, right? So that's a problem for early investigations. It even was the same true for Blue Book. Blue Book officers and stuff like that were always after the effect, trying to get people to draw and describe what they were doing, and you're left with human problems with misperception, lack of memory. Some people didn't have their glasses on at the time that they were seeing them, and so the details weren't there. And some, you could have two witnesses watching the same event, and one witness sees something completely different than the other, or hears something different than the other. So you have that kind of a problem that all comes through when you do a case investigation. That comes through quite often. And so I was telling you even about cases where I had multiple witnesses, like, 20 people that are all watching the same thing. And I would have them, draw what you saw. Well, some are, artists, some are not. The majority weren't, so you got everything from crazy drawings, and then you had colors that didn't match up. And, you were trying to make the best you could out of the entire thing to make it, help you to make sense. But anyway, and then you tried your best to contact witnesses, and took over information over the phone when you could. You have to have them mail a form back and forth, and it was reliant on the mail many times to be able to get other information. And so you really didn't get the complete picture of what's going on quite well. And, even trying to record them, you had early days, you had reel to reel, and you didn't have even a cassette. And eventually we got into having cassettes to be able to do it. So you could start to really get the witnesses emotional, where some of them were quite disturbed by the event. And then, you'd like to be able to get that on tape and have it looked at, and you couldn't do that. Anyway, next slide, if you could. So when bottom line is I got, I was into MUFON and trying to be able to do what I could around the city of Dayton. I was a state section director for a long time. And then, I became also the director of investigations for what they call the Ohio UFO Investigators League. And we were trying to be able to have teams with equipment to run around this in Dayton, Ohio, and other parts of Ohio to do cases. Then our tools started to improve because had better cameras. We had, cassette tape recorders as opposed to the reel-to-reel. We still used the Geiger counters we had. We had some electromagnetic equipment. We had obviously binoculars and various other kinds of things. And those are still pretty much in use at the time. And you'd still do those kind of cases. But, you could start to see that a little bit improved technology. And again, we don't run into computers until much later in like the 80s or something like that. But anyway, I contacted police departments. Basically, my telephone number was all the police departments around the city of Dayton, and they would be able to call me if there was any kind of reports that were coming in, and I got cooperation from a lot of those police departments. I already mentioned that I used radar approach control to also help me identify aircraft in the area. So I was reaching out little by little to as many people as I could to be able to help gather, some sort of data, if you would, some other perspective. For example, you might have a police report at the same time, and that was seen by somebody else in the other part of Dayton, Ohio, and they saw the same object or something of that nature. And so you had that, and you had to look very broadly whenever you did a case investigation, not just with the witness in front of you, but with anybody else, like neighbors or anything around, and help and try to help get as much information as you could. Next slide. Uh, in the case investigation process, we contacted the witnesses, arranged a date and time. You go out in the location, you meet with them, you record their testimony, you complete all the wonderful forms that are out there, everything from trying to have them to draw it to also completing the standard MUFON form, which also was similar to the Air Force form. And you tried to get as much details as you could. Again, going back to there's problems with witnesses. For example, if I asked you what the angular size of a vehicle is a mile away from you, what would you say? And that's probably your only way of being able to determine that. And then also knowing the distance of what would it look like a mile away. If you've ever looked down a highway when you're driving it, you'll see that it's like a little pinpoint further down the highway, right? And you're trying to get those kind of like details. And then at nighttime, how do you determine the distance you will have it, an object, what's the size of it, how close was it? Because if it's very close, it might look big, and the speed might be reported as being extremely fast. But the fact is that it was really at a larger distance, and people can't make that determination very well. And so there's a lot of inaccuracies in terms of that, and are trying to interpret the data when we do get it. So it's problematic. And so you have to use other ways of being able to help them get understanding of size or the distance metrics in place. Anyway, you try to visit the exact spot. Many times I was jumping into fields and going over and walking through briar patches and various other things to be able to get over to where the sighting was, and you're trying to get that through. Or 1 minute I might be out in the middle of a field and there's a bull out there, I'm waiting for it to charge me or something. So, I mean, you collect any evidence you got. So you're all walking out with gear and all that stuff like Geiger counters and you name it. You're trying to go out in the field and to do that. So again, that it's challenged, and you complete your report. You have to come back and write the report up, submit the report, and any of the evidence that you've been able to collect, and then come up with, in MUFON, you came up with a determination of whether it was an IFO or an unknown or whatever it was, and you had a category you had to place it in, and typically had to do your case investigation within a relatively short time. I think it was like 90 days at the time. I don't know if that's still true or not, but you tried to do your best to be able to get the cases done as quickly as you could. And reports were sent into MUFON. Most of them were all paper. It's not like I had to send them through the mail. Yeah. And if you can imagine, and then you'd question, well, did it get to MUFON? I don't know. I mean, I sent it in, and then you go looking for it. Even now, you can't even see it and find it because none of those records are not digitized, right? So I mean, those cases that I did back in the 60s and 70s. I have no idea if they still have them or not, because there's no way for me to actually look at them, So then you had to question that. Next slide, if you would. Well, over the period of my time, the 6 decades, now you had some, various Air Force projects that were going on, Project Sides, Grudge, Twinkle, Moon Dust, Blue Book, all those different things that were going on. You had, in the 53 time period, you had the CIA, the Robertson panel. You could look at that and see how that was treated and find out that it was very poorly treated. You had the Blue Book Special Report number 14 that was done in 55. You got to look at that and get to study. You hear about the after the swamp gas sightings, you had Gerald Ford having a House Committee on Science and Astronautics meeting. So there were a lot of different things that were going on where you had some government openness, if you would, and panels that were allegedly meeting and projects that were ensuing. And then, what happened was after like roughly 1969, when the Condon report came up and basically closed the entire government program, you started to see us going into what I conceivably call the dark ages, because then you had no top cover from scientists, if you would, that would be able to study this at all. They were, refuted and refrained from even publishing papers if they did anything on the topic of UFOs. And so consequently, scientists just shut up and went into their closets and didn't talk about it. And that's a problem, big time problem. Well, then, early in the early days, also as time went on, then you found out that that there was a project in 2009 that was going on. And of course, MUFON was engaged with Bigelow at the time, which was looking into, and there was money that was provided to be able to study this, that worked its way through. Harry Reid and a number of others got engaged with, and so OSAP, and there was like NIDS, but even before that, there was OSAP that came in 2007 to 2009, roughly. MUFON was engaged with Bigelow. That was part of that whole thing. A lot of it was looking into things like the Skinwalker Ranch area and so on and so forth. I'm hearing some sound. Anyway, somebody's got their mic open. Anyway, then you heard it go through and became ATIP. I talked with Lou Elizondo. That's when he came on, and they kind of like moved it into the strictly UFOs as opposed to the Skinwalker Ranch kind of thing. Then obviously we've heard that it went into the UAP task force, and then it became this thing called IMSOG, or what, I don't even know how to pronounce it. Yeah, but it was the Airborne Object Identification Management Synchronization Group, which is, let me tell you, I work in the military. They love acronyms. If I told you where I worked at the base, I'd have to use a whole bunch of acronyms, and you wouldn't, and even telling what I was going to be doing, you'd be like, what? You do what? Anyway, a lot of different projects, and then now we're getting into the ones where we're starting to have hearings and stuff like that that are being held here, which is very, very exciting, because those are coming forth with a lot of information, and very, much like, even like, with David Grush, who I got to meet in 2022 at the conference we had. Next slide. Okay, so then you had the changing attitudes. I was hopeful, like a lot of others, that the Condon report was going to actually do something to help open up, that whole UFO thing, and show that it was legit. And it was very clear that the gentleman you see on the screen, the Condon, Edward U. Condon, who was the lead for it, was trying to get it closed down, didn't even read his own report, and basically helped shut down the entire thing. Which was, sad for me, because ultimately, again, I was hopeful that they would come up with some sort of conclusion. And if you read the report, you'd actually see that they didn't explain 30% of their cases, and so they were unknowns. And so, I mean, how can you come up with 30% of your cases not being, or being unknowns, and then making a statement saying, well, they're not here to threaten our national security. It's, there's no need for us to engage in it, and let's just get it closed down. And of course, then you had the Academy of Sciences that basically blessed this crazy report that was put in place and basically helped shut it down. So let's go to the next slide. So Again, I mentioned that the National Academy of Scientists blessed the Kahn report, and that put the final nail in the coffin. And then any time that any scientists after that wanted to do anything, they were shut off because now UFOs were put in the bin with ghosts, paranormal, Bigfoot, and anything else that bumped in the night. It was all considered fringe science, and not even hardly science. It was just all fringe stuff. And, scientists were discouraged from doing the reports. I remember going to one site where if was trying to teach you how to do scientific research and stuff like that, it clearly stated up there, don't do anything on UFOs. Okay, so much for that. You remember that Jacques Vallée came out with a book called The Invisible College, but it was about scientists that were in the closet that were still trying to be able to continue on with the study, but didn't let anybody know about anything. And so many of those people were in existence, and I would bump into them all the time at the base. They would, UFOs became a laughing matter because if you looked at any of the tabloids that were out there, they were all jokes about, aliens and stuff like that. And you were discouraged big time. Hynek, of course, had left, after Project Blue Book closed, left his role. He started to create CUFOS, the Center for UFO Studies, and to do it his best to be able to corral as many scientists that he could possibly get. Next slide. The tabloids were out there like helping to basically just say that this is all a bunch of crap and hooey. Nobody needs to get involved. They're conveniently placed at the checkout counters in grocery stores, so you'll see those things as you're going through to buy your food, and to be nothing more than just helping to create it and make it into a joke, and so you'd see things like this at the checkout. And you come to find out later on that the lead for the publications was an ex-CIA person who was basically helping to do the misinformation and getting you to believe this. All right, so media began making it a joke. And if you listened on the evening news, it was always a joke to talk about UFO sightings in the area. You might recall the fact that, if any newscaster was talking about a sighting, they were followed up by a laugh, and it was just a joke. And, it was very difficult for you to be a MUFON investigator at the time because you're out trying to do the best to be able to study it and make it into something as serious as possible and credible. And your whole reputation was about that. And anyway, I'll tell you about the reputation. Then I kept getting involved more and more from a standpoint. I later then transitioned over to Washington, D.C., eventually worked for the Army Materiel Command. I was out working with them in the DC area, and I couldn't even have a conversation about it with many of the people that I worked around. Occasionally, somebody would hear about the fact that I was into UFOs or something like that, and they would maybe tell me a story, but nobody was talking about it, and so and hardly anybody wanted to bring it up. Even my family were, like they saw it as being nothing more than a joke, and they would laugh. Oh, there's that Uncle Rich who's out doing this thing, like looking into this crazy stuff, this UFO stuff, and it's just all a bunch of hooey. All right, next slide. So I mentioned that I considered from 1969 until 2017 to be like the Dark Ages. We were struggling as an organization to be able to keep reports coming in, to be able to get investigators who were willing to be able to go and study them, and also to have try to get scientists to engage was doggone near impossible. You couldn't get conversations with many of those in academia. I mean, they just weren't talking, right? Nobody was wanting to do anything about it. You didn't see any papers hardly ever being written on the topic. You wanted to study it, and you just relied on whatever you could hear. If you might recall also that when the Project Blue Book closed, you also had the nuclear cases that were just starting to crop up more and more. Had during that period of time some serious, very serious cases like Malmstrom and everything. that done Loring and a whole bunch of others that were still having these encounters. And so you would think that there would be some, notion about them looking into it. And why wouldn't you consider an unknown object over a nuclear silo as being not national security interest? That's kind of like, that's insane. But yet, nobody in the government side wanted to take it up, raise their hand, say, yea, verily, let's do something with this. And it took a while before that eventually did happen. And that's when those programs like OSAP and stuff like that became started, and they started to have at least some interest that were put in place by a small group of people. And there you go. We have now, but we continue to get cases. We continue to look at them. Next slides. So, if you look at the next several decades that were going on, cases continue to progress, technologies increased and improved. We were able to get computers and various other kinds of things, and we started to have interactions. We didn't have to rely on the postal service for the mail. You could send an email to somebody. Cameras and video cameras, and they continue to progress and improve. Now you were starting to get better videos and various other kinds of things that were able to help you with your investigations. The Geiger counters moved out of the dark ages into something where you could actually use much better ones. You had other tools that you could, basically, start to use in your investigations. And so that we were encouraged by that and allowed you to start to do things in a holistically different way. There was an increasing amount of mobile platforms that were being looked at with elaborate equipment on board. You had everything from now looking in different parts of the spectrum that was starting to come up where you could do a little bit of that. In the meantime, nuclear cases continued, and they still are, by the way. Next slide. Then you have the constant reports of crashes. I was living in Dayton, Ohio, and I was constantly hearing about the Roswell crash that happened, and the fact that the beings, or not the beings, but the craft were taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And if you look at the history of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, you have the originally was called ATIC, the Air and Technical Intelligence Center, followed by it becoming the Foreign Technology Division, FTD, and then now it's called NASIC, which is National Air and Space Intelligence Center. And, I work here in Huntsville, and just over on Redstone Arsenal is the Missile and Space Intelligence Center, which basically gets all those things like Scuds and various other kinds of like missiles and types of things sent to it to go re-engineer it. And that's also what they did with FTD and all those other things, that they would get things sent to them that applied to air or like that they would then, look at and re-engineer it, try to figure out what it was made of or anything like that. And that's what intelligence centers do. And then they pass off the intelligence to the defense industry and leaders to be able to help them understand. So what these technologies are, they pass it off to also your contractors to be able to help them figure out how they can build better countermeasure equipment to be able to go after that stuff like that. So it's all fed into these circles where it's now become, useful intelligence that we can now do something with. So you had, people like Stanton Friedman, Len Stringfield, Don Schmidt. Len Stringfield got into it, wrote 6 monographs on the topic of crashes, that he was getting a whole bunch of witnesses. You have the Don Schmidt and Tom Carey that were dealing with obviously the Roswell stuff. Stanton Friedman, of course, got into it as well with the Roswell kind of case. But you had all these reports of crashes throughout that have happened. And then you were like, well, okay, these are past events. Did they really happen? Did they not happen? I mean, why are we hearing about all this stuff? And I would hear, the whole nature about what David Grush is saying currently is, that's been no surprise to me. I've been hearing about it all my whole the time that I've been doing this. You had the even the crash that happened over in Pennsylvania was, Kecksburg was actually reported to be picked up and hauled off to the military and taken off probably to one of those intelligence centers where they were going to check into it and figure out what it was, how it operated, and everything else. And so that's like going into a big black hole that you never hear about it, right? So the bottom line is that those crashes were being reported. You didn't know if any of them were true or some of them were not true. And of course, you're looking through history in many cases where you only have a few witnesses to go on. All right. But then you have the cases where you'd also find additional information that would support the fact that something like that did happen, right? So you hear about the fact that it's going to the government and the military or somebody, and somebody's got this thing. So how can they possibly deny that the government say that there's nothing to this phenomena when they've got all these crashes and all these materials and allegedly bodies? So, it's just made no sense whatsoever, right? Let's go to the next slide. All right, so 2017 kind of changed everything at least for many. You had the report in the New York Times, the glowing auras, black money, Pentagon's mysterious UFO program that Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal and Helene Cooper put together that kind of opened the Pandora's box and said, wait a minute, there's something going on here with UFOs. And oh, by the way, it was a secretly funded and it had $22 million applied to it. All right, well, that kind of opened up the door. Suddenly, there were 3 videos that were released. I talked with Lou. They used these things first off, they stripped all the intelligent data off of the videos, the 3 videos. And you can do that. You can strip off the sounds and various other kinds of things that like GPS locations, and you can edit the videos, and they're small clips and you can put those out. But it's great when you call it something like, well, this is a lens flare, or when you go through the review committees, or this one here is a balloon, or this one's something else, because they don't think you're calling it a UFO, and so it might have a better chance of getting through there. And of course it did. So as he was departing, the government role, he was able to help put it into what they call the TTSA, to the Stars Academy, that he now was starting to work with, other Jim Semivan, Hal Puthoff, and a number of others to be able to now try to bring this out in the open. And you had Tom DeLonge helping to fund it with his Blink 192 or whatever it was, Blink 92 or 192. Anyway, bottom line was you had that kind of thing going on with TTSA coming out and trying to say that there was something to it. And now, next thing you know, is that these clips are out. Well, they're pretty compelling clips, and I can talk to you about what we did to investigate some of those. Next slide. So TTSA was formed. You also had now the dark ages were kind of changing. Science was once again now being brought to the forefront a little bit because you had these videos that were popping up, and by the way, you could have a hallway conversation in the military base about, did you see those videos? Those are pretty incredible. Those were military cases, and so suddenly you're starting to see that you could have a hallway conversation now that was going on where you could start to talk about it. And then next thing you know is like we formed the SCU and got it going, and putting actual scientific papers together on the thing. And some of our papers are rather lengthy. We looked at a case in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico. That was about 167 pages long. And then we also looked at the Nimitz case, and that's about 277 pages long. And some of those things were being passed up on to people on the Hill, and they started to look at it and they started to get interested. The Invisible College kind of started changing that I talked about. Next thing you know is you have a whole bunch of other kinds of scientists that were willing to join SCU because it was a scientific-based coalition group, and we were trying to be able to do scientific papers and put those things in scientific journals and So you started them to see them come out of the closet, so to speak. Next slide. You had Lou helped put together the 5 observables: positive lift, trans-medium travel, sudden instantaneous acceleration, low observability or cloaking, hypersonic velocity without signatures. And as I pointed out to you early on, UFOs have been doing that throughout history. So it's nothing new, but he just put them into those categories. And a lot of people kept thinking that this was like something new. I'm going like, no, they were doing that back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we didn't understand them back then. And so there's a lot of, and there's even potentially more observables that you could get into. I could get into talking about that. But anyway, bottom line was that became a little way of understanding it. And the nice thing about it, using the terms that Luke came up with, was the fact that you could talk to those with scientists and use those terms, and then they would see it as more acceptable to have a conversation about now, because you weren't talking about, well, the fact that the flying saucer made a 90-degree turn or did this, and you don't even use the word flying saucer. You got away from using, even UFO. You went to UAP because now you could get it at least acceptable to talk to a politician about it, because you weren't calling it a UFO, which immediately, in many respects, became something of the fact that it's a joke, because UFOs were made into a joke, as I pointed out throughout the history, early history. Next slide. And then we started to see now that other countries were starting to gradually come on board and to start, they either came on board or they had projects and were doing something with the topic. And the fact that all along was that these things were global. They've been seen all over the planet. Why wouldn't another another country be interested? Do they also not have concerns about national security? With objects that they can identify flying over their airspace or in their territorial waters. And because they can't identify them, they can't discriminate but whether or not they are also an enemy or an adversary. Come on, that's ridiculous. So the bottom line is you have these politicians in these other countries who have been slow to accept it, but that's suddenly a little bit changing. And you're starting to see, because this is in the science world many times, that they now see it as a little bit more accepting, and they'll talk about it and they'll get engaged. And we're starting to see some of them now actually have and setting up reporting centers. And of course, now we're getting connected, and we have many people and I'm having meetings all the time with people over in Europe. I was asked to represent the United States to presenting to NATO on the UAP subject. So they flew me over to Bologna, Italy, and me and Ryan Graves went over and tried to convince them that they need to look at, doing something more with the topic of UFOs or UAPs, and to look at flight safety, as well as the fact that these objects are seen in space, in water, and then also in the air, and that and a lot of those countries are small. They like Lithuania or something like that, where they don't really have an organization to be able to do it. And they haven't had many reports from their citizens and all this other wonderful stuff. But, again, the larger countries like the Five Eyes and various other things are now starting to take it very seriously. And a lot of it's a wait and see what the United States does with it. They always wait and say, well, we're not going to get engaged in it until we see what the United States does with it. So we're kind of like leading the charge in many respects on the whole subject and the investigations. But they're coming on, and the light bulbs are going off, and now there's more of an embracing that we need to do something with it that's going on. Next slide. So in 2013, just to give you a little bit of history, I was the Deputy Director of Investigations and also the STAR Team manager with MUFON. I was told at a conference that we had, the one in Covington in Cincinnati, we had that basically that symposium at that time, and I was asked to look at a video, and so I looked at a video that was an incredible video. Morgan Bell, who was the state director for Florida, had showed it to me, and it was out of Homeland Security, and so it was a Customs and Border Protection aircraft who had allegedly was taking off and saw this object, and at some point turned on a camera and got about a 3 minute and 54-second clip. And bottom line was that Morgan was telling me that it was handed to him by somebody that he knew, and it came from a pilot in Miami that was with Homeland Security. And anyway, apparently what had happened was that it was like April 25th, 2013, as the aircraft was, the Homeland Security mission was that they were going to go off and check for drug smugglers, and they take off from the Rafael Hernandez Airport. And as they're taking off, they get up in the air and they see that there was a light that was coming in. And, bottom line, it was moving toward the airport. And they're now asking the control tower and saying, like, why didn't you alert us? And I thought you had us cleared for takeoff. And yet there's this object that's coming in toward the airport. And then the air traffic controller tower said, oh, no, hold off, on a FedEx plane, just sit on the runway while we figure out what the heck this is. And the bottom line is they now make a big circle thinking that, well, this is unusual. We'll check it out. And so they made a big circle around it. And they got back to where they almost made it for where they took off from the airport and that same space. And the light that was on it went out. And now they're really interested because they're trying to figure out, well, is this some drug smuggling mission that's right there where they are? And so they have thermal cameras. And so they have the pilot told the operator of the thermal camera to turn it on and follow this object. So they went around a second time and did a loop around and kind of like followed the object for 3 minutes and 54 seconds. There was 7,027 frames that we analyzed when we took a look at it. And then we spent the next 2 years actually breaking down that entire video clip the best we could, looking at individual pixels that were on the image, and trying to detect the size of the object and various other kinds of things, speed and various other types of things. Bottom line was we put our report together, and then we had to all sign non-disclosure agreements in order to be a part of this, because the pilot in Miami said that the pilot that actually saw it was in Agbadia, only wanted it treated scientifically, and they tried to go up through the chain to the Air Force intelligence. They said, well, we don't do that anymore. They tried to go up through Homeland Security. They said, well, we don't do anything with UFOs, and so there's nothing that they're going to do with it. So they were a little bit like, well, where do we go? And then somebody mentioned, well, I can give it to MUFON, and they can get some scientists that will look into it. And so there you go. So we signed the non-disclosure agreements. There were 5 of us. We had a mathematician, we had semiconductor scientists, we had myself, who was working with the military, you had also a nuclear physicist, and then you had Morgan, who had got the video. Well, we took, like I said, almost 2 years to investigate the case and pull our report together. Needless to say, when we put the report out and we got approval that we had done our job and all this other stuff, MUFON headquarters was not happy with us because, why are we doing this as a separate group, and why couldn't we talk to MUFON? And when we said we signed non-disclosure agreements, we weren't going to be able to talk about it, and that's what you agree to in order to be able to do it. So, I ended up at one point being in Irvine, California for one of the symposiums, and Robert Powell and I were called into a private meeting with the board. We sat around the board and explained to them how it happened and what went on. And in the meantime, you had Dave McDonald, who was the international director at the time, not happy with the fact that we were looking at Puerto Rico as a group because, that's his domain. I later pointed out the fact that to him in the 2016 symposium in Orlando, when I delivered a presentation on the case, the fact that it was reported to the Puerto Rico MUFON and nobody was ever assigned to it. And that was 2016. So it sat in the database from about 2013 for 3 years with nobody being assigned to the case. So that's not good, right? So, I mean, in 2017, when we started to see that MUFON was starting to get into the discussion of conspiracies and things like that about beings on the planet, on the moon, and Obama might have been a part of it, and they had those kind of presenters at the conference. We started to see all of the science. I was a part of the science review board. We were looking at cases scientifically every month. There are 5 of us that were doing that. That went to a science review board. They looked into it and would publish the best cases of the year. But what happened was the scientists were saying, I'm out of here. I don't want to be a part of the organization if they're going to get getting into conspiracies. So that's what happened. And eventually I relinquished my role as I was the deputy director of special projects, which was looking at doing technology. I was still the state director for Alabama and Mississippi. And I resigned from all those positions. And the 5 of us kind of said, well, I guess we'll have to put together some sort of a scientific organization. So we created, SCU to be able to go and to try to tackle and keep scientists engaged, because we worked so hard to be able to get them to be engaged that we didn't want to see them now just drop out of, because they said, well, I've had it with all that conspiracy stuff, So our purpose was to get science to come together, and so that's why SCU was formed. And we became, the promoters of getting that to happen, not looking to also do anything that would jeopardize MUFON, because we think that, and I'm still of this opinion, that the reports that you all put together and the fact that somebody investigates the case is what's definitely needed to help us filter out the IFOs from the real UFOs, so we can focus on the real UFOs to find out what the heck they are and how they work, right? And so, ultimately it's about getting an answer and not spending time needlessly on, everything from, camera lens flares and all that other stuff that often gets reported in MUFON or in other databases as well, right? And if any of you know that when you do a case like this where it has a lot of scientific evidence, you're going to spend more than just 3 months or 90 days on that case. It warrants that you spend a lot of time on that case. And something as significant as Homeland Security leaked video of thermal image of an object that now goes around the airport, and it then goes into the water, and it's seen underneath the water transiting and then coming out of the water and splitting into 2. That's definitely something you want to spend time on, and you want to make sure that you really fully investigate it and then put together a scientific report that hopefully then you can get other scientists to now accept and get on board as well. So that's what SCU is about. It's about getting scientists talking, collaborating, and sharing information across all disciplines, by the way. And that's what we want. And that's what's happening. Next slide, please. If you haven't seen the video, I encourage you to go up and take a look for Aguadilla, Puerto Rico video. Again, it was taken with a Dash 8 aircraft that was taken off. You had 4 people aboard that. It was witnessed, by them. They saw the lights. The control tower people saw the lights. It was 9 o'clock at night, by the way. It was complete dark. And when you look at the video, you'll say, wow, it looks like daytime. But that's also the fact that it was a thermal camera. And so you're seeing heat. And where the object is black, that's where they had the settings on black being hot. and white is cooler. You can also reverse that and make white being hotter, but they had it black hot on the thermal. And so you're seeing thermal contrast. Anyway, it's a very compelling photo video. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you. Again, it's on YouTube. You can take a look at it, and you'll see that on the screen all that wonderful metadata you have. Everything from the date, the time in Zulu, by the way. Also the bearing of the aircraft. You also have the zoom settings on this is a Westcam camera. It's got the aircraft's GPS location and its altitude, and we used every bit of that to be able to help us to be able to figure out what this object was about. So if you haven't read a report, it's available because we make all of our reports and things like that available to anybody at exploresu.org. So I encourage you to go up and read it if you haven't done it. Next slide. Again, as it rises from the water, it darkens, means it heats up even more, and it splits into two objects with their own distinct thermal images that are very unique. It's not a lens reflection or anything of that nature. It's two separate objects that, and by the way, the camera, the Westcam camera, is capable of seeing 1/100th of a degree difference. So when you're looking at heat, it can look at that level of detail. So now you're talking about, $1 million piece of equipment that is recording this that you don't often get. And it's like most of the witnesses around the country are using their cell phones, or something like that. This is a holistically different. So that's why it was so in need of being that you spent as much time as you could on it. Next slide. So then in 2015, Robert Powell also became aware in an article in Fighter Sweep about an encounter off the coast of Catalina Island involving an F-18 pilot, and that happened to be Commander Fravor. And also there was a commander, it was a Commander Perth, I believe is his name. He was from the Marine Corps, and it's a situation where they were having an exercise that they were going to go on, and then Kurth happens to see an object in the water. Basically just bubbling up of the water. He didn't see an object at the time, and they were going through this exercise, and they were going to test their equipment and do this exercise. And then you had Fravor, of course, in one F-18. Then you had Alex Dietrich, the female. She was the pilot in the other one, and Commander Slate, who was in the WISO position, the Weapons Systems Officer position. And he was a lieutenant commander for the fighter wing. So we heard about this incident, began our next investigation. We found out that there were some people in a Facebook group that existed for the Nimitz. I became a member of that and started to find out names of who was there and referred some of these names over to Robert Powell. Robert went and was able to then schedule interviews with, we actually spoke with about 18 people aboard the whole event. And so we interviewed Kevin Day, and he told us about, what he had seen, which were some incredible readings from the radar, meaning that he had been seeing over the period of the week in this exercise, objects that were dropping from like 80,000 feet to like seawater in just short times. And then on that one particular day, when they were about to do the exercise with Commander Fravor and all them, he had picked up an object that was out in the water about maybe 100 miles away or something like that. I can't remember now what it was, 40 miles away or something. From their position, and the bottom line is that he vectored the F-18s, the two F-18s, towards where the object was, and he described a thing called merge plot, where they must have been right near it because now the object as well as the aircraft became one, And so sure enough, there was an object and distortion in the water, and then you had Fravor jumping down to go after it and circling around, doing a merry dance with the object as it became swirling up, and then he tried to cut off the circle and to surprise it, but the object knew he was going to do that, stopped in the air, and then shot off and went to basically an unknown position, unknown that it shouldn't know about, but it was called the cap point, which was basically a combat air patrol spot that Fravor and them after the exercise were supposed to go to. And so it very quickly at hypersonic speeds shot off from where it was initially. It went to the cap point, and now they've lost it. And if you've ever heard the, Fravor talking about it, he said it was gone, just instantaneously. Well, we put a report together, or we started investigating it. We spent, again, 2 to 3 years, just looking into that case, and pulled that 270 some odd page paper together about what we looked at. We looked at 3 different things. There was a video that was taken. We were able to look at the video. We were able to analyze it, determine the speed of the object there. We were able to then also take the fact that you had Kevin Day reporting that the fact that the object dropped from 20,000 feet to stop above sea level in 0.78 of a single second. So before you can say the number 1, it had already dropped 20,000 feet and stopped. And then you say, well, let me see if I can, okay, we know the size of the object. It was roughly about maybe like 13 to 15 feet high. And then it was allegedly like, about 40 feet wide. They called it a tic tac because it looked like that tic tac like candy. There were no apparent, propulsion systems on it like we typically see. It was just a white object that was there. And, it was moving at these incredible speeds. So we took a look at the physics that would be involved if you have an object the same weight and it's about the same size as the F-18. If I took an F-18 and I dropped it from 20,000 feet to obviously stopping above the water in 7/8 of a second, what would the physics be of that? And first off, as you very well know, it would disintegrate because and this was going roughly about like, Mach 50. So, it was going at hypersonic is 5 and above. And this is going, at Mach 50. And when we took a look at that physics of that, the fact that you should have had a sonic boom, you should have had kinetic energy being released from the drop. You would expect inertia to have made whatever was on the inside a puddle. If we were in it, it would be a puddle on the bottom of the floor of the thing when it stopped. Then you have to think about like when we do things like shoot off at speeds, we increase our acceleration. And then we have to, in order to stop, we have to decelerate, which means we have to apply a force to be able to stop, right? So if it was 0.78 of a second that it dropped from that distance, so it means it was accelerating, and then halfway down, it had to apply brakes. So now we're talking like which fraction of a second that it did that, right? So you're talking about an incredible speed. You also looked at the video. The video was also doing at least Mach 50 when the object is out at this distance that this thing object that was being picked up on that when it shot off to the left. And then when you talked about the fact that Fravor saw it, and then within like seconds or something like that later, it was his cap point, and you looked at the time that would have happened for him to go from this point to like 40 miles away. It was also a Mach 50. So, and above. So you're talking about what are considered to be interstellar speeds. If I had that craft and I could fly it without that resistance in the atmosphere, the non-heating up, the sonic boom, and I had the same from my pulse, I could literally go from this side of the universe to the other side of the universe in probably a little over a month. So we're talking about interstellar speeds that the objects are already maneuvering around with, that then, going back to the various hypotheses about where these things come from, are you talking about an ET that can do that? Sure. Well, why not? And what kinds of things are they doing? Are they reducing their mass of the object to zero? Are they stopping it from having any mass? That's how they could do that. How are they stopping? What kind of a thing that are they doing to be able to do that? So you try to like put that in the realm of physics, and you're struggling to figure out, well, how do I do that? And our report then, like I pointed out to you, went up. It was filtered up by Chris Mellon to a lot of different players up on the Hill, which then starts leading into a lot of those meetings that you're hearing about, where they're now saying, well, we need to look into this, right? Because we don't know what it is. So we were helping to provide the science and the study. Next slide. And again, this is just talking about the fact that, going from the 20,000 feet altitude to 0.78 seconds, stopping above the water, that there's no heating, no sonic boom, no kinetic power, no disintegration of the object. Shape was not aerodynamic at all, no propulsion system. And, what does that? We haven't got anything like that. Now, next slide. So obviously, we've got different terminology. Now we have a tic-tac. We got people reporting tic-tac shaped objects. Okay, we have people reporting triangles that are up there. And I talked about the fact that, gone are what they call the cigar-shaped craft. It's more like cylinders now. You hear people talking about that. You also don't hear as much about discs, yet they remain the most commonly reported when we did our study on shapes and stuff like that we're working with in SCU right now. Does shape really matter? Does it make any difference? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't make any difference, because they can all do those kind of incredible things. Next slide. So our challenges remain trying to be able to do scientific research in a very complex and controlled way, as opposed to an uncontrolled way. Studying a phenomenon that seems to be sporadically able to appear, with no predictable pattern. That you're doing, poor signal to noise ratio of UFOs to IFOs, meaning the fact that there's so many IFOs, we just, we're wasting our time on looking for the UFO quite often, because we find out that we just don't get good reports that are solid enough to be able to do something with. There's fewer reports and a decrease of intriguing sightings, including physical evidence. So we're not getting as much in the way of that physical evidence that we need as well. And then the reduction of the number of daylight events. It seems like that there's a huge increase towards people seeing lights in the sky that don't really reveal much of anything to you. So there's a challenge there for us to study this, because nighttime observations don't give you the details about the shape of the craft or anything about it. People will see 3 lights at the sky, and in their brain, they make it into a triangle. And so suddenly you have a triangle report. And it's just 3 lights. We don't know if they're separate lights or not, but they don't see a structure. They can't tell you about the structure of the craft. I see somebody asking a question real quick. I'll just make a reply to that. We're starting to look at the nature of the what do disc-shaped objects do that cylinder shapes don't do, that and try to see if shapes in terms of missions means anything that we can figure out. And so we have a study that we're actually doing right now. It's called we're looking at the kinematics associated with certain shaped craft. I pointed out to you before, like the falling leaf pattern that the discs made, that now you have triangular shaped objects that can remain perfectly still in the air and don't have that falling leaf effect. Where do we see triangular shaped objects? Well, I got, started looking at the fact that it seemed like a lot of those things were showing up at military exercises. which then made me curious as to whether or not triangular shaped objects were around those live fire exercises, and that's what their mission is. But again, until we do the proper study on these things, we don't know yet, but we're going to get there. Hopefully that answered your question, sir, or ma'am. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of challenges, the overall lack of progress and paucity of the physical evidence that we get. Our understanding of the phenomena is still entirely based on, like verbal and written reports. There are some, events that are using different kinds of measures. That's helping, but again, you don't have, for example, on radar, is it calibrated properly? We don't know. Is the radar, is that why sometimes they're picked up on radar and sometimes they're not? Because it might be a calibration problem. The physical traces, as we pointed out to you, the fact that if we're not collecting evidence in the proper way, then we don't necessarily get a lot of information that we can work with. Pictures. Most of the time, they're taken by people, witnesses in the visible range. We need to see what they look like in other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. For example, ultraviolet. What can like an object in ultraviolet give us? What can it do? And we've already starting to see the thermal ranges or in infrared, and we're starting to see it in near infrared, mid infrared, and far infrared, and starting to get a better understanding about objects. We need to do that as well, and get improved, photographic evidence, even in the visual. We're starting to use things like LiDAR and a whole bunch of other technologies to be able to help us to get information about it. So the technology tools are starting to help, and it's starting to come in, and we're starting to get some information, but again, they need to be done under controlled conditions as opposed to just random or one-off, because a lot of times you just don't get whether it was properly calibrated or something of that nature that would cause it. So we're looking at medical records. We need to do a better job holistically in the abduction phenomena. Sad to say that, I get reports all the time from people who are claiming that type of thing. And, you couldn't get a medical doctor or a psychologist to play into it at all. We were struggling to be able to, help get them, because, not necessarily trained in that field. And I've always been one of those people that likes to get smarter people in that field to be able to help me out. And if I were the, investigator in a state, whatever like that, now I'm looking into abduction. What do I know about psychology? What do I know about medicine? What do I know about anything? And so people would show me their arms where they have golf ball size, protrusions, and saying that they had some sort of an alien, whatever device in them. I said, well, did you get it checked with a doctor? No. And I'm like, well, maybe you want to, Anyway, bottom line is that we don't have those kind of people coming in, engaging in that whole area of that. And sad to say, we had people like Dr. Mack and all, and all these others that were trying to help spearhead that. And of course, Kathleen Martin with the ERT and everybody, that all those people were trying to be able to help in that world. But we don't have that discipline in place to be able to really do what I think scientifically we ought to be doing with that to help us to really get solid information. So it's very sad in that whole aspect. Next slide. Well, again, we got everything from LiDAR. We're starting to have meetings and starting talking with people over in Sweden about LiDAR technologies. There are a lot of apps that are coming out now, smartphones we have, that I encourage people to use the tools that are on smartphone. I can now conduct an entire investigation from my cell phone. And let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Think about what I told you before. When I did this before, I'd have to mail the witness, post office. I had to go and have them do some sort of drawing. It was always after the fact, right? Think about what you can do now. You can have a witness who can turn on their camera and be allowing you to see the object as they are seeing it, right? We can do a FaceTime. You can show me what the object is. I'm able to take that and I'm able to look at Google Map, find out your exact position, where you're standing, see your house, know that you're standing next to a tree. I can then go to my app that I've got for aviation and look to see if there's any aircraft above you for your spot and say, hey, do you see any aircraft? And I'm seeing one. And if they say no, then, well, that's an interesting thing. I can also look at the stars and planets above you. I can look at satellites above you. I can do a whole lot of different things directly from my cell phone when I'm talking to you while you're still having that experience. So, I mean, it's absolutely incredible what you can do right now. My phone is also a Geiger. It can be a Geiger counter. I've got devices that I can attach to it and now make it into a Geiger counter. I've gone on case investigations where I'm now using it to also fly my drone. And I've got cameras attached to my drone I can go up and look at. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there's a tremendous amount of these tools on that phone now that that could help an investigator to the nth degree that I didn't have back when I got started. And I encourage you, if you're not doing it, to use it to your advantage. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are things like, I'm sure you're probably aware, some of you might be aware, Flight Aware, Radar 24. You can see where the aircraft, some of the aircraft are, not all of them. There are some that are still, appearing and not there. You can't see, obviously, things like where drones are. The flight radar and some of them actually do track where balloons are, by the way. Balloons also are providing some of that information. You have things like plane finder you can go to. Next slide. I'm just trying to illustrate that these are some of the aircraft recognition. I can do a plane ID. I use some of those things to be able to show different angles of aircraft to witnesses and say, did it look like this? Did it look like that? And so you can do that to help analyze the type of aircraft. I live on a flight path right now of the Huntsville airport, so I'm constantly seeing aircraft. And I use that to also get my understanding of the size of it, because I interpret that from how big is it, and can I measure the degrees that it's that, like the moon is like a half a degree, and so like you can figure out, well, okay, like it's twice the size of the moon or something like that at a distance. You learn the distance and you practice, and helping people to understand it. Next slide, please. There's heavens above that allows you to see everything from where the ISS is to a thing called iridium flares. Iridium flares are up there, and they're satellites that glint and get the sun, and they reflect down, and you get a big flash. And I had people reporting iridium flares, that I've been able to check on and find out that it correlated with the time and the location. Heavens above, of course, to be able to see where some of the other types of natural things are. Where's the planet Jupiter that people, where's the planet Venus that people often report? You can do that with those tools. ISS often is seen as being an object going across the sky. And I've seen the ISS, and it's pretty, wow, it can really zip across there. It's pretty bright light. Anyway, next, please. You've also got Stellarium, a common tool that you can go back and reset the clock and stuff like that at a given location. You can see what that's about. We're starting to connect into the various other things like all sky cameras that are being reported. And we're looking at FAA, the flight data, and I'll talk to you about drones, but actually there are drone incursions. And so we have a project now that's going through that. We're finding out in the FAA drone database that there's things that you could call to be UFOs. They seem to be performing more like that than they are about drones. So they're being reported there as well. Next slide. Again, GeoSat Watch, ISS trackers, there's a whole bunch of tools. Next slide. Satellites are fascinating. This is one I like because this is it's called theodolite. It costs you a little bit of money. I want to say like maybe $3 or $4 or something like that to be able to get it. You can put it on your phone. And the nice thing about it is that it gives you where your direction, your GPS location, all this wonderful data that I'm talking about, your bearing that you're looking at, which direction you're looking at. It's also, you can use it to determine height of the object or the altitude, because you can do trigonometry from this tool. You can take and have somebody actually send the data to you or to a scientist that goes along with all this wonderful stuff that you're seeing on the screen. So you can use that again to do trigonometry and find out the altitude of the object, the size of the object, and a whole variety of things. Just because and we should really be having and encouraging our witnesses and people out there to use this to actually record or take a picture of what they're actually seeing, because it helps you. For example, it also gives you the perspective of, you can use this like picture and have the witness draw its altitude and say it was above the tree line. Oh, there's the tree line, right? Or it's below the tree line, or it's above the house. It was just above the house. And you can have them draw the apparent size of the object in comparison to the house. And you get a closer estimation now of what the object's size was, where its position was, than you can normally get from any photo that has none of this on it. So really, you want to encourage people, and I tell this people all the time, this is a great tool to be able to help you to work with witnesses, help them to understand the size aspects, the altitude aspects. You get the direction that was going on and where they were standing, the GPS location, and from the photo, you get more. It's all wonderful data that you get sent to you. Okay, next slide. Obviously, Google Earth helps you to see. Like I told you before, I can say, oh, you're standing next to that tree or next to that pool. You're looking at a certain direction. Okay, I can get that from here. I'm able to go and see what the distance that was covered. I was able to calculate speed using Google Earth. It went this distance and this time, and I can put that and measure it on Google Earth, and I can find out, and I can tell you that speed pretty quickly. Next slide. There's also night vision capabilities on your phone. You've got for investigations, I also can go and take a look at, for example, all that wonderful data of that photograph you took. I can say, well, your GPS, some phones will give you the GPS location. It will also tell you the time that you actually took the object, where you were, and you look at the EXIF aspects or the metadata on the photograph to help you to do your, and you can do that with your investigations. All right. So I look at all the photographs that I think that are relatively credible. I put them under EXIF viewers. I also look at things like whether they were embedded into the photograph, and I can look at the pixel level, the deep pixel level, using a tool called ImageJ. It's a free tool that you can get from NIH, the National Institute of Health. And I can zoom up to like 800 times the image of the object. And so, I mean, I'm able to look at that and I can see individual pixels in the cell. I can measure the pixels and tell you the size of the object in comparison to some other things as well by looking at the pixel size and the field of view information from the camera. So again, great tools. Next slide. Meteor showers you can look at when they scheduled. You can look at a calendar and find out when that's going to happen, because those often get reported as well. Next slide. Weather Underground. I go back and I use Weather Underground and a number of other things to be able to look at what the weather was on that given day and that time. You can look at if they say that the object was just below the clouds. Okay, you can go in and look at the cloud data and get the METARs, what they call it, METARs, where the cloud actually the altitude that they were at, and you could then use that in your analysis to be able to figure out as much as you can about the cloud layers and where they were. We use atmospheric soundings, which tracks. You have all these wonderful weather balloons that are being watched around the multiple times of the day. at airports quite often, and they give you the basically the speed at that different altitudes that you can then use. And you say that if the object was at 20,000 feet, you're able to look at, you know, wind direction, wind speed, and various other things at 20,000 feet by looking at the soundings of the weather data. Next, please. Your phone has a lot of other things. You can use it for EMF detection. There's a Tesla meter tool that allows you to see whether or not that there's any kind of like electromagnetic field interruptions. I can record the data. I can also pass that off and play it back and look at that. Next slide. You also have on it a sensor toolbox, which will give you everything from these different kinds of data sensors that are part of your iPhone camera. Everything from gyroscope to gravity indicators to geometric fields, linear acceleration, accelerometers, rotation vectors, pressures, microphone locate. It gives you a whole host of things that you're able to also look at as sensors that objects can also, you know, track or record. So I encourage you to look and consider that as well. Next slide. So you can see from what I'm getting at is that bottom line is that the technology is advancing and continues to advance. Now you're going to be having things like AI tools and various other things you'll be able to use to help you to do things. Drones allowed me to operate above sighting locations to see if there was any traces that I couldn't see from the ground. You know, seeing other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, again, as I pointed out, is now becoming a lower cost element. There are better tools for acoustic capture. In other words, when we say that these objects are silent, is that really true? Or is it just because it's out of the range of human hearing? In other words, is it above or below our hearing capabilities? In fact, there are some cases where, like for example, in Sweden, where people are detecting, actually, no, I'm take that back, it was Norway. In Hestland, Norway, where people are actually hearing the objects first, and then they go out and they see them. So it's not always true that they're silent, and some actually have humming noises. Triangular objects tend to often have some sort of like a humming noise associated with them, where you didn't get that with a disc-shaped object. Again, the acoustic capture is something we need to really study. Better cameras, better, you know, are able to see at larger frame rates and various other things are very much needed. We're getting from 4K to 8K, you know, wow, think of the resolution there. And alerting tools are being developed to assist in letting us know about reports in your area, which is another thing that I've talked about. You want to be able to have an alert that goes off, the fact that you have an observation so you can go out and see it, photograph it, and somebody else is doing it from a different part of the city is doing the same thing because they got the alert. And now you can triangulate the object's position in space. Next slide. So you got MADAR. A lot of, you know, Francis Ridge and stuff like that has been pushing the radar thing. UFO DAP, Ron Ulch is also doing some other things. We're seeing a lot more technology that's coming and being used. We also are now engaging the Earth observation satellites that they're doing in the European Space Agency, which will be able to now help us to also look from satellite levels. And that's openly available to the public. And we're encouraging that. And plus, NASA's also developing tools to be able to use satellites for their own detection purposes as well. And then we're continuing to have conversations with, by the way, Aero and a whole bunch of others in terms of how can we cooperate and help doing scientific work with them as well. So it's all good. Next slide. UAPX, I don't know if you saw a tear in the sky. That was one observation that was a 5-day observation off of Catalina Island with a lot of different equipment. But these are the kinds of things we're trying to encourage. They're partnered with SCU as well, and we got a number of other partners as well that are doing that. Next slide. So we're a little bit about SCU. You know, we're a coalition of like-minded individuals, basically scientists, we are not scientists, but researchers who believe that science ought to be able to solve the equation and try to our best to be able to follow scientific principles. We got everything from all disciplines, whichever psychologists, medical doctors to physicists to and we're all talking to each other about this. We're over 300 members now. 31% of them are PhDs, and 56% of them have advanced degrees, and stuff like that. So we have very educated people that are engaging with us and working with us now. And we have a whole host of different projects we're doing, which are all science-based. We're composed of a lot of different people. We have both current and former members of NICAP and MUFON and everything, all part of us. I mean, you don't have to be you can't be a part of MUFON and then join SEU or whatever that's all about. I mean, that's ridiculous. I'm still a benefactor with MUFON. I'm a lifetime member of MUFON. I'm just not active in working to do the science stuff with them as much as I am now. But anyway, our aim is to do scientific studies, to publish papers, to be able to get our work published and made it available, and being as transparent as we can. We have the annual scientific conferences, published newsletters. They're all available online in our website, and you can go up there and check things out as we do that. We also are putting press releases, trying to encourage the government to be able to continue to get and treat this thing and scientifically, and and there needs to be more cooperation amongst all global players, and so we're pushing for global participation. Next slide. And we just had our 5th STU conference. These are all the types of people that we had. Ross Coulthart was our keynote. We had Julian Mossbridge, who was talking about neurosciences, how that comes into play. Joshua Pearson got into talking about, the intelligence world and how they apply their principles to studies. He did his doctoral dissertation at the conference. Kevin Knuth is a physicist, along with Matthew Shadegas at the University of Albany. Doug Bittner is a PhD out of I think it was in Oklahoma or Utah, somewhere out in the Midwest. He had Nick Schnell, that was one of his students. Beatrice Villarreal, she's from Sweden. A great presentation on transient objects we have a database project that we got going on. And then we had an SU panel and a whole host of it. And we had Micah Hanks as our moderator. It was a great conference. That was just happened around the beginning of June, the end of May, and a lot of good things talked about at that conference. Next slide. So some of the studies that we're doing right now currently are nuclear intention study, and then you heard from Larry talking about what that they're doing. Larry Hancock was at your meeting. USO, looking at USOs in terms of just where they are, the distribution and the cases. We're looking at UAP characterization study. That's why I told you about the shapes and the maneuvers and size and colors and things like that. We're looking at that. Drone study, I told you about the FAA, and then we're looking at propulsion effects in the atmosphere and electromagnetic signatures. And so we're doing scientific work around that as well. So, and there's a lot more, but that's just some of the topics that we're addressing. Next. We partner with a lot of different organizations. We're all working as a coalition to be able to solve the phenomena. And so we support each other. Japan 3AF is, I was just on with them over in France. That's one of our international partners, as well as the Project Testolin effort going on. But the rest of them are pretty much here in the United States, and we're all getting together to be able to say, we've got to combat this thing and come up with, some sort of answers. Next slide. In summary, as you can pretty well tell, over my 60 years, a lot of things have changed. I've seen it all. I've heard it all. Government acceptance. It's finally the UAP exists. We've got now full government investigation is about ready to unfold. They're actually all going to have to play in. There's the stigma that's being reduced gradually, and we're starting to see more and more report sharing and sharing of data. I can have those conversations in my building at work, and that's okay. Scientists, universities are now engaging and actually supporting and funding projects on the topic. Technologies have made a huge advancement. We're able to do a lot, and now it's cheaper. Databases, we're starting to have AI, machine learning, and quantum computing in the future. Well, that's going to be exciting. Cost of technology have dropped. There's more collaboration on a global basis. We finally got people talking to each other, and I'm thrilled about it. So that's my presentation. I hopefully, you got something from it. I'm sorry if it was like boring because it was walking you through the history of things, but I just wanted to give you a perspective that it's like I've gone through a lot in my time with this whole topic, and it's not very often you get to talk to somebody that's been at it for as long as I have and played a critical role in trying to bring it forward. I think we can end the slide share, and if there's any questions or if you want to, if there's any interest at all, you want to talk, or I don't know what your time level is. We've already gone probably well beyond the time, and I apologize for that.
Actually, it was really interesting hearing about all of your experiences. I don't know anybody that probably knows any more about the phenomenon than you do. So we really appreciate you doing the presentation for us. We are running a little low on time, but I still would like to take a couple questions. I want to make sure that we get to Fargo, the Grand Rapids location, and any other questions from people online. So any questions here in Fargo? I'll have you come up by the laptop. We really need to get a microphone. We're technologically disadvantaged here.
Okay, can you actually see me in terms of the instead of the presentation now, or what?
Yes, we can see you still.
Oh, okay, all right.
Hi, Rich.
Hey.
Hey, this is Jason in Fargo. I'm curious, or I guess my question, given your 60 years of experience and all of the cases that you've seen, like that you've been tied to, whether as an investigator or some other way, like you have this collection that validates that the phenomena exists, but what stands out to you as like a breakthrough case or one or two cases where it was like, ooh, where you get a little sneak peek at that solving the phenomenon, at that, like, what's next? Like, has there been a case that stands out to you like that?
So I didn't tell you about this, and thank you for the question. It's an excellent question. In the mid 70s, I had, first off, I have to understand, I was like I was skeptical of the whole phenomenon. I was trying to be as objective as I could, even at the young age, but it was like I had never had a sighting. I'm thinking like, wow, I wish I had a sighting, but I've always been around cases where there's some like physical evidence or something like that. But in the mid 70s, I had my aha moment. My aha moment was going on a case up in Carrollton, Ohio, where a farmer had done, there were a whole bunch of UFOs the night before that were seen in the area. And then the next day, he's looking out of his second floor window or something like that down on his field, his wheat crop. And in the middle of the wheat crop, there's a 70-foot area where there's no wheat anymore. It's gone. And he's like, not sure what the heck that was, but he called up the MUFON, I guess, or something like that. We ended up, Larry Moyers, I think, was the state director at the time and stuff like that. And anyway, there was a team that was sent out, and we got to go out there. And so we're doing the investigations and laying out the grid like you typically do when you're a MUFON. You learn how to do a grid pattern and take samples and stuff. Bottom line was that as you went from you're standing in the middle, there's no indication of any wheat anywhere around that's been damaged or flattened, or, like some equipment was brought in to do this. There's no wheat there anymore. right? In fact, if you go down 2 feet in the ground, you don't see any roots. They're all gone. And then as you progress, and there's a depression in the middle of that, but as you progress in any direction from the center and getting out toward the edge, you start to see that there's a little bit of root that shows up underground the further out you get. A little bit beyond that, you see a little stubble of wheat that's maybe above the ground. And then out beyond that, then you get a rotational pattern of the wheat. And then you see a puffed wheat, 70-foot in diameter area where it's puffed wheat, which means that heating was applied to it, right? So, and you're also detecting that there was like something along the lines of a microwave radiation detected, at the site as well. And you're going and you're standing there and you're looking at this and saying, well, the only thing that you could do would be to drop something from above to be able to create this. And then what could create that? And, you're perplexed. You're trying to figure that out, and you can't come up with any rational explanation for it, how overnight that would happen. Now, this is not a crop circle. Okay. This is an effect from something that's rather large that has now done that in the center of the wheat field. So that was my personal turning moment, my aha moment, where I realized that I didn't have to see one to be convinced that there was something there. There's something there, right? And so that was pretty incredible moment for me. Obviously, over my history, I've done thousands of cases, and I've seen incredible cases that to me also are just as incredible. I think also when we got to the Aguadilla case and when we looked at the Nimitz case, where you actually now have these scientific tools that are giving you data about speed and everything else, and you look at the sheer volume of witnesses and the fact that it was not just eyeballs on it, it was eyeballs and various sensors and aircraft and all this other stuff, that becomes one of those compelling moments additionally, where you've now got scientific evidence that you can haul off that nobody can account for at all, period. And so those are probably among my favorite, along with the 1976 Iran case, where you have the electromagnetic effects that are being two F-4 aircraft, their navigation and their missile systems, and also the control tower experienced those electromagnetic effects. So there are some very compelling cases out there that of which you've got multiple kinds of data that you can use to help substantiate that it did take place. Hopefully
Very interesting.
Hopefully that gave you something.
Let's move to Grand Rapids. Any questions in Grand Rapids, Jer?
No, I don't think we have any. No.
How about online? Looks like we've got 14 folks online right now. Any questions online before we let Rich go?
Yes, up here, Brad.
Hi, Brad. Go ahead with your question.
Yes, fascinating presentation, Doctor. I'm fascinated by the equipment that we have available that's so low cost. I haven't been much of a fan of watching any of this stuff from Skinwalker, except one thing led to another, and I watched a little bit of season 4 and now season 5, and there is some fascinating observational data being collected by some really, really cheap and inexpensive stuff. And most of the equipment they're using is under $500. I mean, everything from single board computers, Raspberry Pis, to simple RTL, SDR radio receivers. The fascinating thing is that 1.6 gigahertz signal that seems to be showing up there, as well as what happened in that film that you talked about, shot at Catalina Island. But my question is, can you talk a little bit about the LiDAR device and how what's involved with that? Because they mapped out at Skinwalker, which is just so fascinating. They mapped out a cone with a distinct point using a ground-based horizontal scanning LiDAR device. Now, I don't know. My background is in science and engineering. We used LiDAR from either satellites or planes to map surface depressions, water courses and all that stuff, elevation changes. I don't know how this ground-based thing is operating. Could you explain that?
Yeah, I know that they're so you have multiple tools that are going on there. They're using everything from ground penetrating radar, to be able to see what's kind of like below. And that you see over the seasons that they're continuing to advance even its capabilities to be able to see that. But you also can, you're also using, LIDAR, which again, you have the radar. I know you know this, the radar, which is a radio signal being emitted, and then you're looking for the bounce back, and you're looking for the time that it takes to be able to get that. The light is shooting, a photon basically to the ground or whatever like that, and then coming back and being able to interpret the distance. And you see them coming up and showing you, for example, that it seems like the GPS locations for different devices end up below ground at sometimes. If you take a look on a satellite chart for like 1.6 gigahertz, that is actually the frequency that GPS satellites use to communicate. So the now 1.6. So the big question then is, since you're having all these anomalies with GPS, is also that tied into whatever this GPS satellite is? And you have to look and also beg the question that, and I've talked with Travis, and I've been out to the ranch and stuff like that. There's a tremendous interest from also our adversaries about that location. So you have to understand some of even the objects that are being seen, that are being misreported, could hypothetically be drones and various of other things that are trying to observe and record and capture what's going on at the ranch. So now that's become an additional problem. And you've seen even the helicopters, the military helicopters, and some other things that are out there as well. So there's concerns even about that. But going back to your point about the LiDAR technology, it's not going below ground as much as it's reading an area above at the ground level. And there are other tools that they're using to be able to help give a different picture of that. But there's, for some reason, you'll see when they're using not the LiDAR, pardon me a second, where they're actually seeing like those, like, I don't know, like think of it like a cloud or something up,
Yes.
coming up from the ground. And they're also detecting a whole variety of other things with a lot of other tools. And I'm encouraged by what those tools are. What I'm waiting for, and I told Travis, Travis is like my neighbor here, and we talk all the time. He's from Huntsville, and bottom line is they keep trying to be able to get more and more technology, to be able to figure out what that they can, but they have yet to take all that data and converge it into anything like a document or an actual study that you could pass off and have it, looked at. And I said that's one of the problems that I see with the show. And then you have to understand the fact that even Travis will tell you that 1/10 is what you see on TV of actually what's being filmed. And a lot of it's on the cutting floor. And so you don't even get to see all the science that they might be doing actually to be able to do what they do. Okay. So there's problems that, in the sense that you have entertainment mixed with trying to do an investigation using scientific tools, and it's not being properly represented as the science. It's more the entertainment.
Oh, I absolutely recognize that. I've done stuff in the film industry, so I know what's required there. But I also I'm quietly chuckling because I'm now watching seasons 1, 2, 3. I mean, I'm going back and looking at where they started to bring in the tools. Okay, and these are very cheap, inexpensive devices. And I know from a production company that they're not going to spend a whole bunch of bucks on spending stuff. So expensive stuff, those photon cannons, those LiDARs, all that stuff is from a third party, and the production company just saying, hey, we'll give you guys some free advertising. It's not Travis's equipment. They're just quote unquote borrowing it at a really good price, i.e. zero, from someone else who is sort of curious too. So it's amusing, but I didn't realize that well, perhaps I should have, because of some other projects I've been involved in. You know, first of all, Russia gets involved and China gets involved, and like how many other people, how many other eyes do we have looking around this thing? So that's an interesting thing. But I was really curious, how did they map out that cone? Because LiDAR requires a reflection of some sort, and yet that means that there's got to be a solid that's reflecting a beam.
So I'm talking with a woman who is up in Sweden, and she's also picking up and looking, and she does point clouds and various other things with LiDAR data. And she's seeing things like triangular shaped objects that are up in the air, or she's seeing some of those strange like clouds that are coming up off the ground in her LiDAR data. And she's saying like, this is the same kind of stuff you see on Skinwalker Ranch, but we don't have an explanation for it. Why is it happening over in Sweden in a similar fashion? And yes, the photons are hitting something and they're reflecting back, and they're pointing out and making it look like a cloud of some sort, or a whatever swirl. And so what is that it's actually hitting that's creating that? And we just don't know. And so we're having teams to try to figure out, are these errors? Are they something else? And we just don't really know.
Well, as Dr. Bob McIver has told me numerous times, good science starts with some observations, and let's go from there. And we'll ask a lot of questions. It'll demand answers to a lot of questions that we don't have right now. So kudos on Dr. Taylor Travis's work. If you see him, tell him way to go. Big thumbs up here from the center of North America, Winnipeg, Manitoba. Really got turned on by the equipment that he started to use there. So yeah, well done, Dr. Taylor. And thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you so much, Rich. It looks like we're getting close to being out of time, but we really appreciate the presentation today and your time. Lots of really wonderful information.
Well, thank you for inviting me. And I just want to say a shout out to all the people up in the northern part of the country. Thank you for taking and listening, and thanks for doing what you're doing.
All right, thank you so much, Rich. Full disclosure for everyone, Jer and I are both members of SCU as well. So just want to be open and honest about that. So thank you again, Rich.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. Take care.
You too. Say, Jared, looks like we're just about out of time. Are you okay with ending the meeting and then doing that quick drawing that we were going to do?
Yeah, we can do that if you don't mind. Stop sharing.
I'm going to try and figure out how to do that without ending the thing.
There you go.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us at the Fargo location and at the Grand Rapids location. We do have a little raffle, not a big prize, but we'll probably do it a little differently here in Fargo than a regular raffle. So thank you everybody for joining us online, and I'm sorry we didn't get to our cases, but we will definitely get to them at our next meeting in August.